Welcome to Lecture 3, the recorded version due to today's earlier power outage. In this lecture, we'll cover the 3 properties of water. This is going to be important for your case study this week. We'll also briefly look at the 4 macromolecules again and their corresponding monomers, and then spend a lot of time looking at protein structure, as this is the basis of your lab this week. Okay, here are the learning objectives. Just make sure you have a look at these. So, why is chemistry important? If we look at the organization within organisms, the base level is molecules. So things like atoms and other molecules come together, basically form cells, which combine to form tissues, and groups of tissues working together form organs, and organs working together form our organ systems, and eventually that all makes up the individual. So once we understand how things work at the molecular level with chemistry, we can kind of understand the basis of how living things maintain homeostasis and function normally. So a big part of our body and what we're going to look at is water for today. So the properties of water. 67% of our body is made up of water, and as we saw last week, water is an important component of metabolism and chemical reactions. Water allows us to maintain a normal body temperature. Water has a large role in our blood volume, and it allows us to transport nutrients and salts around the body to the cells that require those items. So we must look a little closer at the properties of water. So it's basically the chemical nature of water that allows it to function a specific way in our body. And there's 3 main properties that we'll focus on. So first of all, just looking at the structure of water, H2O is made up of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. The molecule of water is known to be a polar molecule. This means that there's a slight electrical charge to this molecule. So we can see that each oxygen atom has a slight negative charge to it, and each hydrogen atom has a slight positive charge to it. And so each molecule of water is known to be polar. Because of these slight charges, different molecules of water will interact with one another through a bond called a hydrogen bond. And so what that means is for each hydrogen in the water molecule that is slightly positively charged, it will be weakly attracted to the oxygen in another corresponding water molecule that is slightly negatively charged. So because of this opposing charge, it creates a type of weak bonding known as hydrogen bonding. Because water is a polar molecule, it can therefore easily dissolve substances and is basically the primary solvent in our body. So it's an excellent solvent, meaning that it's able to dissolve materials into it, and therefore when the materials are dissolved in the water, they can easily be transported throughout the body. So things like salts and charged ions and charged molecules easily dissolve in the water and get transported from one area of our body to another. That feature of water, what makes it so important in our body for homeostasis, is that it basically allows us to maintain certain chemicals within the body and transport them from one area to another. So something to think about then, relating to your case study this week, is if we were dehydrated, meaning that the water content in our body was lower than normal, what would be the consequence? So relating to this property of water, if water levels were low, then we wouldn't be able to transport substances throughout the body as well as we normally would in a situation if we weren't dehydrated. So it would affect the transportation of nutrients and other molecules throughout our body if we were dehydrated. Second property of water is known as water having a high heat capacity. So the description of this property is that it takes a lot of heat to raise the temperature of water. So there's a lot of heat energy that needs to go into the water in order to cause a change in its temperature. How does this relate to our body and homeostasis? Is that because it takes a lot of heat energy to raise the temperature of water, our body temperature can stay relatively constant despite any kind of fluctuation in temperature that we might be exposed to. So extremes of heat or extremes of cold, our body maintains a relatively constant internal temperature because of this feature of water. Because this property of water, we can maintain a constant internal temperature. So if we think about the case of what happens if we are dehydrated, water content in our body is lower than normal, and so therefore we would have difficulty in maintaining a constant internal temperature if our water content is low. The third property is known as water has a high heat of vaporization, and the description of this property is that it takes a lot of heat in order to cause water to evaporate, in order to cause it to go from being in the liquid state to being in a gas state. So a lot of heat energy is input to cause water to evaporate. So what this means for our body in homeostasis is that as we sweat and water evaporates off our skin, it allows us to cool down. So because it takes so much heat to change the water from a liquid to a gas or a vapor, that heat then is being used up off our body in order to cool us down as the sweat evaporates from our skin. In the case where if we are dehydrated, then we don't have enough water, we can't create as much sweat, and therefore we won't be able to cool ourselves down as easily. Okay, so your case study this week just deals with the three properties of water. So in order to best prepare for the case study, make sure you review the three properties of water, be able to list them and state them, be able to define and describe each property, and also explain how it relates to homeostasis. So why is the property of water having a high heat capacity important for our body in relation to homeostasis? And then also you want to think about if we were dehydrated, so the content of water in our body is lower than normal, what consequence would that have on our ability to maintain homeostasis? What would be the effect of dehydration for each property? So in your case study this week, you'll be given one property, so we'll basically state the property, and then you need to identify which property that is. So we'll sort of describe it, and you'll have a multiple choice question where you decide which property is being described, and then from there the property that you've chosen, answered, is the one that you're then going to go into more detail and explain how does this property help our body with homeostasis and maintaining homeostasis. And then you'll also further explain to say what would be the consequence of dehydration in relation to this property. So the effect of the water would be slightly lost because of dehydration and what that consequence would be. So it's best really when you're studying to actually go through all the properties of water, make sure you can list and state all three, also describe all three properties and relate them to homeostasis, and then discuss sort of the consequence or the implication of dehydration. So being prepared for all three properties, but knowing that in your case study this week will really just give you one. So you don't know which one, so make sure you go over all three of them. Come and speak with one of your instructors if you're unclear as to how to prepare for this case study. Some information about acids, bases, and buffers. The definition of an acid is that it releases a hydrogen ion into solution, into water, whereas a base will release a hydroxide ion. When we're looking at the pH of a solution, it's really a measure of the concentration of hydrogen ions. So if we look at the pH scale, 7 is a neutral pH. Anything below 7 is defined as an acid, and anything greater than 7 is defined as a base. In our body, we have important buffers that basically prevent drastic changes in pH. And so how they do that is either by adding or removing a hydrogen ion when needed. So a common buffer in our blood is known as the carbonic acid buffering system. And so if you look at this equation, if we start with carbon dioxide, it combines with water, and there's some enzymes that help catalyze this chemical reaction. And because of that combination, we form carbonic acid, so H2CO3. In carbonic acid, it can easily dissociate or break down into ions known as the hydrogen ion, or H+, and the bicarbonate ion, HCO3. So with this system, if the hydrogen ions start to increase their concentration, meaning there's a high hydrogen ion concentration and the pH is maybe moving towards an acidic pH, then the bicarbonate ion can combine with the hydrogen ion, take it out of solution so it's no longer a free hydrogen ion, and form carbonic acid, thus buffering out that hydrogen out of solution. If, however, the hydrogen ion concentration is falling below normal and the pH is getting to be a little too basic, then the carbonic acid will dissociate in order to release more hydrogen ions to solution and therefore bring the pH more to a less basic pH and possibly towards a more acidic pH. So this buffering system is really important in regulating our blood pH. It's one of the conditions that we need to maintain in our blood. Our blood must remain around 7.4 pH as part of homeostasis. The molecules of life. So you do have a table that looks like this in your lecture notes. Okay, so you've already known and been familiar with the 4 macromolecules: carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins. And this chart shows you the individual subunits or monomers to those macromolecules. So each macromolecule is a large molecule made up of individual subunits. So for complex carbohydrates, those are monosaccharides. For lipids, they are glycerol and fatty acids. Nucleic acids, their monomers are nucleotides. And proteins, their monomers are amino acids. We'll go into more detail in today's lecture on protein structure and on the amino acids. So just to make sure you do look over this table, make sure you can memorize it, fill in for each macromolecule what is the corresponding monomer. We looked last week at monosaccharides, so an example being glucose. It is a 6-carbon molecule. OH, highlighted here, that is known as the functional group of this monosaccharide. It's called a hydroxyl OH group. And basically, for functional groups, they're really just atoms within a molecule that kind of influence how they're going to interact with other molecules. So you've got a few more slides relating to this content here, the macromolecules, their structures, and their subunits. So just make sure you review that on your own time. I'm going to move into another monomer, which is a nucleotide known as ATP. We looked at that last week. It is the energy molecule in the body. So we saw during cellular respiration how it is produced. In order to release the energy from this molecule, one of the phosphates from the adenosine triphosphate, which there are 3, one of the phosphates gets broken off, and as that bond gets broken, energy from that bond is released that the body can harvest and use. Therefore, the result of breaking that bond, you end up with an ADP molecule and a free phosphate which has been released, and then energy gets released from that action as well. Okay, we're going to move into proteins. So I'm only able to record about 15 minutes at a time, so I'm going to stop the lecture midway here and then create another recording to go into protein structure and enzymes and denaturation.